18, toward the end of World War I, William K. Dean was brutally murdered, and his body was dumped into a cistern on his farm in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Here's how it began. Chapter 1, The Farmer. The road leading to William K. Dean's home was a winding country lane that rose gradually, twisting and turning, passing fewer than half a dozen houses until it reached a point overlooking the town of Jaffrey, New Hampshire. In 1918, Jaffrey consisted of two villages, Jaffrey Center, which lay to the west, with the larger and grander homes of the more affluent residents, and East Jaffrey, a typical New England mill village with a river running through it, the factories, railroad depot, and homes of mill workers nearby. Jaffrey's residents were a mix of hard rock Yankees whose parents and grandparents had tilled the soil, raised sheep, and cleared the hillsides, living alongside recent immigrants who worked in the mills and factories. On the evening of August 13, 1918, William Dean rode down to East Jaffrey in his buggy, reluctantly leaving his wife Mary at home. The Deans had been happily married for 38 years, but in recent years, Mary had begun to suffer from a mild form of senility that was attributed to softening of the brain. While not a complete invalid, she was nevertheless prone to memory lapses and occasionally mixed up her words. Neighbors who saw Dean drive into town that evening thought he seemed somber and distracted, as if something was weighing on his mind. It was a Tuesday evening, and the night the stores in East Jaffrey stayed open until 9 p.m. to accommodate those who could not conduct business during the day. Dean first stopped at Goodnow's, the flagship store of a dry goods chain that would eventually spread across New England. He made a few purchases, then walked up the street to the post office and Duncan's drugstore, which shared a building. He chatted with a friend named Georgiana Hodgkins, then crossed the street to drop off some laundry at Myers' dry goods store. He crossed back over the street, bought some currant buns at Bonnie's Market, then walked back to his buggy parked behind Goodnow's. According to Georgiana Hodgkins, Dean gave her a ride to the nearby home of her brother-in-law, Charles Rich, who was perhaps Dean's best friend. Just before Dean and Hodgkins arrived, Rich had sustained a kick in the face from his horse and was bathing his wounds with the help of his wife, Lana. Dean visited with the Riches for a time and then headed home. It was the twilight of a sweltering summer day, and as Dean drove his buggy out of town, children were playing in the road. Not unusual at a time when few horses or vehicles would come along to interrupt them. Dean rode past the home of Mrs. Emma Chenard, who beckoned to her children to let him pass. According to Mrs. Chenard, he tipped his hat in his polite way and continued on his way. A number of other villagers, relaxing in hammocks or rockers on their porches in hopes of catching a cool breeze, also saw Mr. Dean as he drove by. They waved, bid him good evening, and simply nodded pleasantly. They did not know it was the last time they would ever see him. Chapter 2, The Town. By the fall of 1918, the United States had been at war with Germany for over a year. The war brought victory gardens, Liberty bonds, and reports of German U-boats prowling the waters off the East Coast. Despite the war, day-to-day life in East Jaffrey proceeded as it had for decades, much as Thornton Wilder described it in Our Town, the quintessential New England play set in the southwest corner of New Hampshire. You come up here on a fine afternoon and you can see range on range of hills. Awful blue they are, says the stage manager who narrates Our Town. And of course our favorite mountain, Mount Monadnock's right here, and all around it lie these towns, Jaffrey, North Jaffrey, Peterborough, Dublin. The stage manager, from his vantage point in Peterborough, where Wilder wrote the play, could well have seen William Dean's hilltop home, some 6 miles away to the southwest. At the time, most of the region had been cleared of trees to provide pasture for sheep and wood for fuel, and incidentally providing unencumbered views of mile upon mile of rolling hills. The Deans lived in a small bungalow perched on a windswept knoll 100 yards off the old Peterborough Road. Past the bungalow another 100 yards was a large summer house the Deans had built and which they'd been forced to begin renting out when finances were tight. Between the two houses and down a slope was a barn where Dean kept his few animals, one or two cows, his horse, a flock of white turkeys for which he had become locally known, and an assortment of stray and cast-off animals that the Deans had taken in. Standing in their yard, one could see Mount Monadnock rising majestically to the west, Massachusetts to the south, and on a clear day, the Atlantic Ocean, 80 miles away to the east. It was an isolated but starkly beautiful location with only the sound of wind, birds, and the occasional night-calling owl to disturb the peace. In Jaffrey, the Deans were much loved for their kindness and hospitality. They appreciated literature, music, and art, and hobnobbed with wealthy summer residents who descended on the region during the warm summer months to attend theater, concerts, and art exhibitions. The summer people often brought visitors to the Dean's hilltop farm to see the magnificent views of the mountains and the surrounding towns and villages. Mary recorded the visitors' names in a guest book, and in one season, she noted as many as 600 visitors. It was an idyllic way of life that came to a sudden tragic end on the night of Tuesday, August 13th, 1918. According to Mary Dean, her husband arrived home at about 9:30 that evening, his usual time when returning from the village. He brought in his purchases, ate one of the currant buns he had purchased in town, and smoked a cigarette. At about 11 o'clock, he went to milk the cow. Dean was viewed as somewhat eccentric by his neighbors in that, contrary to accepted practice, he milked his cows at noon and midnight so that he could sleep late in the morning. The Deans were accustomed to staying up into the early hours of the morning, reading by a light that locals reported could be seen a great distance away. Before he headed to the barn, William told Mary he would return at midnight and asked her to have a hot supper ready for him when he returned. He took a lantern and pail and left to do his chores. Mary heated some soup and waited for William's return, but he didn't come. An hour passed, then two. She began to grow restless. The Deans were creatures of habit, and it was unlike him to deviate from his usual routine. She felt certain some mishap had befallen him, but why else would he leave her alone for so long? She waited through the night, occasionally dozing, then startled awake by the rustling of wind in the trees or the shrill bark of a fox in the woods. Her husband never returned. How did I come to write this book? Several years ago, I had finished a long run of a comedy variety show that I had been involved with, and I was looking forward to turning my attention to some other projects that I had had to put off when I was contacted by the Jaffrey, New Hampshire Historical Society, asking me if I would write a play to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the murder of William K. Dean. And honestly, when I first got that request, my heart sank because as much as I knew this was an iconic event in the area, but they wanted me to involve people from town and playing parts in this play, and I knew it would be like herding chickens. But for anybody who's lived in the Monadnock region of New Hampshire, the Dean murder is an iconic event. It's like the Battle of the Little Bighorn or the sinking of the Titanic. Everybody knows about the Dean murder in that area. I first heard about it from my mother when she moved to the area. And even decades after the murder, people who were in Jaffrey were reluctant to talk about it because it had split the town in two. But I decided I would proceed. I would accept the commission and do the play, but I was going to do it as a one-man play with an audio-visual component. I think of it as kind of like a Ken Burns movie with a live narrator. And with people in town doing voiceovers to images of the original people, the witnesses and the suspects, sometimes reading the voices of their own grandparents in the play. Well, the play debuted on August 13, 2018, 100 years to the night that William Dean was murdered, and it was very well received. And in the course of writing the play, I had done a lot of research. I read thousands of pages of FBI documents, the transcript, of a trial, grand jury investigation, which was hundreds of pages long. A couple of early books that were written about the Dean murder. And the challenge was that having done all this research, it occurred to me that a book should be written about this, because a contemporary comprehensive book had never been written about the Dean murder. And the problem was that, you know, for a 90-minute play that I had done, you only needed so much information, and I had this much information that I thought, well, there's enough there to do a book. The other challenge I had was that the murder has never been solved, and so that sort of made it a challenge to write the book. But eventually I decided that the book needed to be written because William Dean was a good man. He was a patriotic man who loved his country. Everybody loved him. And a grave injustice had been done to him. And I felt like he deserved to have the truth told about what happened to him, to whatever extent I could discover. So I dove back into the research and spent a couple of years reading thousands of pages of FBI reports, court documents, the complete transcript. And the challenge, imagine that someone has given you a 1,000-piece puzzle. The problem is they haven't given you the box with the picture of the puzzle on the top, so you're not exactly sure what the puzzle looks like. You may not have all the pieces of the puzzle. And some of the pieces that you have may not even go to this puzzle. That's what it was like putting this into a book. Well, it took about 2 years to write the book and another year to go through the writing process. And that's how I came up with this book, Deepwater, Murder, Scandal, and Intrigue in a New England Town. The alternate title of this book could be How I Spent the Pandemic, because that's how I spent my time. But the thing about this story is that it's like a classic Agatha Christie mystery. There are plenty of suspects and red herrings and clues, just like a classic mystery. And I decided to divide the book up into 3 acts for comprehension to make it easier to follow. First act is murder, and that's an explanation of what happened and how people thought had happened at the time. The second act is called Revelations, and it's all the stuff that we have learned since then. And then the third act is called Justice, and that's where I retell the story, but I fold in all the things that we now know about what actually happened. Well, you know, in a classic mystery story, let's see, now it's not working. There we go. Okay. You always have a lot of suspects. So in the Dean murder case, there were a few suspects. The first suspect was his wife, Mary Dean, who, as I said, was in the early stages of Alzheimer's and was apparently the last person to see him alive. Another suspect was this guy, Charles Rich, a very powerful and connected local banker, justice, judge, the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge, and politically powerfully connected, and William Dean's best friend. But the day after the murder, he appeared in public with great bruises and scratches on his face, which he was never able to really explain successfully. And then the third suspect was this guy. It's not a great photograph, but it's the only photograph I've been able to find of this mysterious character. His name was Lawrence Colfelt. He and his wife and stepdaughter were tenants in the big summer house on the Dean property, tenants of Mr. Dean. And this guy was what we would probably call today a trust fund baby. His grandfather was a very wealthy person from Pennsylvania, left him a lot of money. He didn't have to work. He spent his time riding his big Marmon automobile around Jaffrey, New Hampshire, riding his horses and everything, living the high life. If you wanted to raise suspicion in a small town at the end of the World War I, this was the way to do it. It also didn't help that his last name Colfelt sounded vaguely German, because one of the theories was that the murder of William K. Dean had something to do with German spies being in the Monadnock region. Well, okay, so a classic mystery. You have your suspects, and then you also have investigators or detectives. In the case of the Dean murder, the prime investigator, the first one, was this guy, Roy Picard. He was the county solicitor in southwestern New Hampshire for Cheshire County, It's what we would call a district attorney now. Picard was a young guy, he hadn't been on the job that long, but he had already developed a reputation for being tough on crime. Another as investigator was this guy, William de Curler, very interesting guy who started off in Europe, basically on the vaudeville stage as a speaker. He had set himself up as a psychic. Basically, this was a guy who did all different kinds of things to try and make money. He was eventually kicked out of England and Europe for fortune telling, which was illegal at the time. Came to the United States, set himself up as a writer, wanted to be a journalist, and a psychic private detective. He was invited to New Hampshire by William Dean's brother to look into the Dean case, and he was either the best thing or the worst thing to happen to the case, depending on who you believed. And then you had the agents of the Bureau of Investigation. It was not yet the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a part of the Department of Justice. This was men in the early days, many of whom were actually volunteers, and some of whom were more or less qualified to be on the job. They might have had backgrounds in criminology. A couple of them were basically into forestry and that kind of thing. And as I say, they were more or less qualified for the job. There's a great story in the book about a time they were out at night a lot. They had come initially to look for lights that they thought were being flashed from Mount Monadnock, Germans signaling over to the seacoast. This had been reported that there were signals, so the FBI sent men to look. They'd be out at night, in the middle of the night, looking for lights flashing. One night they were out at the farm, or looking at a farm from a distance, and they saw a light come out of the farmhouse and move across to the middle of the farmyard and then stop. It was dark. All they could see was the light. It stopped for about 8 minutes and then moved back to the farmhouse. They fixed that place in their minds so they could see in the morning what it was. It was an outhouse. So this is the kind of thing that they got involved with sometimes. And then, of course, in a classic mystery, you always have witnesses. There were many witnesses to the Dean murder. One of the chief ones was this woman, Aria Morrison. Her husband's family were the founders of the town of Peterborough. Very wealthy family, a wealthy woman, very stylish, as you can see here. They had houses in Boston and in Peterborough. The day before Mr. Dean's murder, she met with him on a social matter, but then he asked her if she knew anybody, had any connections with the Department of Justice in Boston. She did. Her husband had worked in government roles and again, was wealthy and pretty connected. And she said, yes, I do. And he said to her, I want you to contact them and get them to send an agent up here, one of their best men, because this is important. And as it happened, she was going to Boston the next day, and she said that she would pass along the message. Well, it was so important, and he seemed so concerned. She said, well, why don't you tell me what it is? I can phone them. And he said, oh no, it's far too dangerous for a woman to know this. Which sounds like chauvinism, but he died that night. So there might have been something to it. Another witness was this interesting character, Charles Bean, a local guy. He was a photographer. He was a nurse. He had nursed people during the Spanish flu plague that had happened earlier. He was a dancer, and he was also a gossip. One of those people that if you wanted to know what was going on in town, you talked to Charlie Bean, whose nickname was Crazy Bean, because people didn't always know whether the stories that he told were real or ridiculous. But he ends up being an important witness in the Dean case. And then you have this young man, Frank Humiston. He was a horseman, very talented guy. He worked for Lawrence Colefeld, the tenant who had lived on Mr. Dean's property. And he overheard Colefeld and his wife make many disparaging remarks about the president, about England and its position in the war, and remarks of support essentially for Germany that did not look well for the Colefelds. And of course, in a mystery, you always have evidence. This slide shows evidence that is still being kept by the Jaffrey Historical Society. You have some of the clothes, the shoes that Mr. Dean wore on the night he was murdered. You have pieces of wood that had bloodstains on them, taken from the steps of his barn. You have doorknobs that had blood on them, and a bloody blanket that was wrapped around his body before he was dumped into a cistern. And the most damning piece of evidence, perhaps, is this calendar. It's a farm calendar, and back in the day, farmers would use a calendar as a kind of an unofficial diary to say, what the high and low temperatures were for the day. But after Mr. Dean's death, this was found in the kitchen, and on the date of the 13th, you see Mrs. Dean had written, "Billy die," which turned out to be very problematic for Mrs. Dean. There were other pieces of evidence. At the bottom of the cistern where Mr. Dean's body was found was a silver cigarette case that was pulled and apparently had some kind of inscription on it that looked like it came from Germany. Also found near the cistern was a woman's tortoise-shell hairpin, matching exactly a hairpin that was found in the bedroom of the house that the Kohlfeldts lived in. There was a threatening note that Mr. Dean received shortly before his death, like a week or a few days before his death. And according to one witness, it said something about him shutting up. If he didn't, he was going to found himself dropped into a well. And finally, there was a large crate. The Kohlfeldts had left Mr. Dean. They had a falling out with him, and they had left his property shortly before the murder and moved to nearby Temple, New Hampshire. And among the things they moved was a very heavy wooden box, which according to Kohlfeldt contained a Victrola. But the men who moved it said it weighed about 500 pounds. Victrolas do not weigh 500 pounds. Now, the interesting thing about these last four items of evidence, the cigarette case, the hairpin, the note, and the wooden crate, all of those are missing. We don't know what happened to them. They disappeared, especially the silver cigarette case, under very mysterious circumstances. There was a report that was done by the county solicitor, Roy Picard. He brought in a Pinkerton agent named Harry Scott. Pinkerton Agency, well known, founded around the time of the Civil War and best known for protecting supposedly Abraham Lincoln. Roy Picard had contacted them. They sent Pinkerton agent Harry Scott. He did a report about the investigation and did a report. That report is missing. I contacted state, local, county officials. Nobody knows what happened to the file with the investigating report that was done by Picard and Harry Scott. It may be that it's still in some attic or a cellar in a box somewhere. Could be that it was just thrown out years after the fact because people didn't know what it was. Or it could be that there's a more nefarious reason for that file to be missing. Fortunately, before the file went missing, a guy named Bert Ford, a reporter, got access to it. Ford had been essentially an embedded reporter with the Yankee division, an army division that went over to Europe, called the Yankee division because it consisted mostly of people from New England. He was there with them. The war ended. He came back. And this is about a year after the Dean murder had happened, and it pretty much quieted down. His boss, the editor of the Boston American newspaper, called him into his office and said, there was a murder that happened up in New Hampshire a year ago, and it's never been solved. Why don't you go up and see what you can find? So he went up and he spoke to Roy Picard, the county solicitor, and he asked if he could see the notes or records. Picard pulled out the file with all the notes that the investigation by the Pinkerton agency. Bert Ford knew he was onto something. He went to a hotel room with an associate. They stayed up the entire night taking notes from that file and the investigation. He went back and he wrote an entire series of incendiary articles about the Dean murder, which blew the case wide open again and got people interested all across New England in the murder of William Dean. About a year later, he pulled all those articles together into a book called The Dean Murder Mystery. published in 1920. The first book that was written about it. It's got a lot of interesting stuff in it because it's the only way we actually know what was in the original file that is now missing. It's also kind of yellow journalism. You know, his point in the articles was to a certain extent to attract readers to the Boston American newspaper. So the tone is sometimes histrionic, but it's also very important as a piece of evidence. The book was published, it was in the imprint on the inside, it said privately printed for the relatives. Well, there was 1,000 copies printed. William Dean did not have 1,000 relatives. The book became very controversial in the town of Jaffrey because Jaffrey was split down the middle about who had committed this murder. Was it Mr. Rich? Was it Mrs. Rich? Was it German spies? And this book was so controversial that copies of it were burned. The local library couldn't keep a copy because people kept stealing it. And Bert Ford, you know, he sometimes might have felt like he was in danger. I spent years writing my book, and at this point, I feel like I'm really not in danger, although there are times when I have to like look behind me. So that's about all I have to say about the book. Warren, do you have any questions about the case that I can answer?
What did you find was the hardest thing to research?
The hardest thing to research? Well, it depends on what you mean by hard. The grand jury report is about 300 pages long, and it was a tough slog reading the whole thing. It was actually the first thing I did was to read through the grand jury report, and it's very confusing. And in the book, I explained there's a reason the grand jury report is confusing. I think it was done in a way to make it confusing and to hide and obfuscate rather than to clarify things. After I had done all kinds of research with newspaper articles and FBI documents, I would start to realize that there was a connection. Like something that I had seen in an FBI document would refer to something that I saw in a newspaper article, would refer to something that happened in the grand jury transcript. So I could start to put all those thousands of pieces together. So I would say in terms of a tough slog, that was probably the hardest thing, was to make my way through the grand jury transcript and then to try to start putting all these pieces together. And at the end of the book, the one question that people come up to ask me, and especially Jaffrey, when people knew I was working on this book, they would come up and say, "Who did it?" And I would say to them, "It's an unsolved murder. I can't tell you." Except that in the book, I come up with a solution at the end that I think could be what actually happened. And I leave that to the reader to tell me whether it's convincing. It's a solution that fits all of the pieces that we now know that people didn't know at the time of the murder. And again, I leave it to the reader to tell me whether I have a convincing argument about what actually happened.
So I guess sort of following off on that question, what was like was there one or two things that you really wish you could find or that existed that you couldn't? Like, you know, the report that you said is mysteriously missing. Was there anything else?
What do I wish could be found? Yeah, I sure wish that file would turn up somewhere. It's not in the Cheshire County Courthouse documents that they have an archive. It's not there. It's not on the state archives. And it's just frustrating to think that the answer to a lot of questions could be in that file. I get this image of, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
At the end where it's put in that whole TV show about the place where they put all the mysterious stuff.
Yeah.
I forget what it was called, but it's sitting somewhere in a box.
Is that Warehouse 13 or something?
Yeah, Warehouse 13. Yeah. So maybe that's where the file is, in
maybe.
Warehouse 13. You know, people have asked me, for example, the Jaffrey Historical Society has a bloody doorknob, and still has blood stains on it.
Yeah.
And apparently at one time, there were fingerprints and blood on it. And so they sent it off because they didn't have, at the time, forensics was a brand new science. So they didn't have much, but what they did have was fingerprints. The problem was that it was so smudged, they couldn't get it decent. Now, of course, we have DNA studies, and people have often asked, well, couldn't they do DNA? The problem is that this is an iconic event, and for years, Jaffrey students would study.
Yeah.
The Dean murder, and they would bring in the evidence and they would pass the doorknob around.
Oh, that
So
was,
there's no way they could give a decent DNA.
yeah, also, I mean, does it deteriorate after a while if you know it's been left there for
Yeah,
years? I imagine it's not necessarily as,
yeah.
I
You
mean, I
know,
know
if it
finger-
had not been touched, if they had known about blue latex gloves and
Yeah.
police tape and everything, then maybe something might, but no, it's possible.
yeah, I know fingerprinting had been around for a while.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think trivia, the first fingerprint case was in I think Argentina that they solved
okay,
a murder using fingerprints. Um,
yeah,
Lucitek, I think the detective was. It was a woman who had murdered her children and she tried to blame it on the neighbor, but then they came in and they realized, oh, it was her
they did
fingerprints.
fingerprint stuff, yeah.
I mean, other methods that sound like were more brutal. Apparently, they still did resort to torturing people, but they also had the fingerprints. But you wouldn't expect that to be in Argentina.
Right, no, yeah, yeah. Well, I guess that's about it. Oh, you know what, maybe I'll just mention quickly a couple of my other books here. These were written under a pen name of Michael Manley. The Family is set in San Francisco. What if the world's leading social media platform was a cult? What if you signed up? What if you couldn't quit? That's the premise behind The Family. Then I wrote this book with a friend of mine, Probability of Detection. It's about canine search and rescue. A beloved senior broadcaster, think of Walter Cronkite or somebody like that, is in an assisted living place. He's got the early stages of Alzheimer's and he goes missing. His daughter is a canine search and rescue worker, and her team is called out to try to find him, and she's not the only one looking for him. Probability of detection. And that leaves us with deep water. Thanks very much.
And if anyone has any questions later on that they think of, I can get you in touch with Ken.
That'd be great.
Thank you.